Alright, hello guys, and welcome back to Ian Explains, YouTube channel that needs no explanation. Today we'll be discussing the dip pen. Dip pens have been used for a long time by many people as a writing implement. They used to be more common for writing just any everyday normal thing, but eventually they grew out of favor for things such as fountain pens, and eventually the ballpoint. Now then, how are these things used? Well, first of all, you'll need some materials. You want to get paper. I suggest fairly thick paper. You don't want paper that's too thin, otherwise the ink will bleed through and feather and just generally make a mess of itself. I also suggest getting smooth paper, because rough paper will catch on the front of the pen and it can clog up your pen. Second, you're going to need some ink. Any old ink will do. Make sure you don't grab fountain pen ink, because fountain pen ink is runny, and try to avoid like corrosive inks. Generally, inks made with like walnuts or oak gall ink, things like those tend to be pretty corrosive, and unless you're really taking care of your nibs properly, they can rust. Trust me, I've made that mistake before. The ink I'm using is just a black acrylic ink that I got at a craft store. And yeah, you're also going to want some water. This water already has some ink in it because I was cleaning off a pen earlier. But yeah, it's useful because you want to clean off your pen and keep it clean so it works well. Along with the water, you're going to want paper towel. Help dry off your nib, wipe it off. And finally, the pen itself. The pen itself is actually two parts. There's the nib holder, which can be made of wood or plastic. I'm not sure if they're made of metal. I think there's ones made of metal. And this holds your nib, which is this part, when you're writing. Now then, the nib. Nibs are made of metal, and they're pretty sharp, except for some. There are some blunt nibs, because there are different types of nibs for different reasons, for different purposes. There's writing nibs, drawing nibs, calligraphy nibs. This is a nib that I found at my grandmother's house, and yeah, I've just been using this. Let's put the nib in here, and I'm going to explain a bit about how this works. So a dip pen works because if you zoom in, you can see there's a little hole there in the nib. That is called the reservoir, and that holds ink. You can also kind of see there's a split in the nib right there, and that separates the nib into tines, which is this part and this part on the other side. And what happens is when you dip the pen into ink, the ink is held in the reservoir, and when you write, it runs down that split, the channel, and out the tip of the nib onto paper. So let's start writing, shall we? First we grab our ink. We're going to give it a good shake, because it needs to be shaken up before I use it. I'm going to carefully uncap it, because you don't want ink to spill. It's a big mess. Alright, set that down, and let us take our nib, and we want to dip it into the ink. Now then, when you're dipping the pen in, first of all, try not to get the ink past like here, because you can get ink onto this, and that's like messy, and it can get on your fingers. So dip it in, and you can see how this is dripping with ink, so I just wipe it off on the side a little, because that way I won't get blotches on the paper as much. And I start writing. When you're writing, you want this side on the top facing upwards like that. Okay, now since I finished writing, and I'm probably not going to be writing with it for a little while, I'm just going to give it a quick little rinse. And dry it off on my paper towel here. Alright, so what are some of our advantages and disadvantages of the dip pen, especially versus a ballpoint pen? So in the pro side for this, it creates a little more variation than a ballpoint pen. You can see if you look at the lines that their thickness varies a bit, because a dip pen's line thickness will vary based on how you might tilt the pen, or how hard you press down, or any number of variables like that. A ballpoint, on the other hand, has no line variation. You can see when I write below, I'm gonna have to excuse my terrible cursive. You can see the ballpoint doesn't have really any line variation to it. And so that's one reason that these are really popular with artists or calligraphers, which is writing really cool and fancy and stuff. And yeah, because you can create different line thicknesses, which is good for drawing and stuff like that. Okay, so let's focus on the cons. So the one that a lot of people know is you have to keep dipping in to the ink occasionally. This isn't actually as big a problem as you might think, though, as I've found out before, because these can generally hold a bit of ink. Another con is that these aren't extremely portable. You can't just carry one in your pocket and pull it out and then start writing. Fountain pens are an improvement on that, where you can still have the nib, but not have to do that, but it's not quite the same, I feel. Another issue is that these tend to have a bit more come with them. Like, you have to have the right paper that's the right thickness, and you have to make sure you wash it off when you're done so ink doesn't dry, and it's a lot more of a hassle than using a ballpoint. However, the rewards can be really cool. Alright, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.